everyone's
Mhm.
just like, how much do I need to know, right? Like there's an endless amount of like machine learning. Like,
Yeah, so it was after the hiring freeze. I think it was probably like a few weeks after. So I was just like, I think maybe I was talking to one other company at the time, which
yeah,
was actually ByteDance, which owns TikTok.
yep, yep.
So I was still like, oh, that actually sounds like a really cool company. So like I still had like a small glimmer of hope, but the thing with ByteDance was like I saw them as like this up and coming like social media company like Snapchat and Facebook. So like the bars for Snapchat and Facebook are pretty high. So like
Yep.
I didn't like my chances too much at ByteDance, which spoiler alert, I actually got an offer at ByteDance not too
Oh,
long
wow.
ago.
Nice.
So yeah, that was pretty cool. When I didn't need it, of course. Um, but yeah, and sorry, I lost my train of thought. I
Oh, you're
forgot what you.
saying that you were on like the cusp or on the rise of like getting a couple more interviews, right?
That's right.
And you had that
Uh,
one other interview at TikTok. Yeah.
right. So yeah, so in terms of like what I did next, just like on my journey, because obviously like getting rejected doesn't feel good. But the first thing I did first and foremost was like, okay, let's sort of open up this can of worms. Like, why did I fail that interview? And yeah, it opened up the worlds of like just regression in general. So I just studied regression, linear and nonlinear regression, and
Mhm.
everything in between basically. Like obviously you can solve a linear regression equation with like gradient descents, or you can solve it using like least squares calculation, blah blah blah. Like how do you
Yep.
measure performance? Like it's one thing to have like a good solid understanding of regression, but it's another thing to like do these things yourself. And it wasn't until like I started yeah, just like really getting into the weeds of it that I felt comfortable with it. And I was like, okay, this is sort of the right mindset to have. Just because like in data science interviews, half of the time you're not going to be asked to recite some formula. You're going to ask to do that formula or like to actually solve a problem in practice.
Hmm.
So it was a matter of like understanding what's the breadth of things I need to know and like how deep am I at each of those things. And yeah, just trying to identify like the weak points was really the difference maker, I think, in terms of just feeling more confident about everything. So
Gotcha.
yeah, that's basically what I did next.
Okay. Uh, I guess how did you figure out the depth towards how much you needed to know everything? Because I think one thing that I've also heard a lot of is that when you're tasked with like a machine learning problem, right? Everyone's
Hmm.
just like, how much do I need to know, right? Like there's an endless amount of like machine learning like material out there, right? So it's just like if they're going to ask you something completely obscure, right? I mean, I personally would say like let that happen and then just move on and like never work at that company again. But I guess how did you kind of like figure out how much you had to study for everything?
That's a good question. I mean, I think the first thing was just understanding, like you mentioned, actually, yes, there are going to be obscure questions, and you don't want to go into that rabbit hole of like spending too much time on something that's really niche
Yep.
and something that probably won't get asked in most interviews. And like you said, if you do get asked something really obscure in an interview, then like it may not be a good fit anyway. To be honest, especially if their bar is so high. Um, for me, I felt that like my machine learning background was like pretty solid, and like I think prior to this, I had passed the triple byte machine learning engineering exam,
Okay.
and that's actually one thing I want to bring up. So that's one part of the answer to your question is like you have to sort of test yourself in a way because it's so hard to test yourself without any external feedback. So yeah, so I went on triple byte, and I'm not sure if the people that are watching this know what triple byte is, but just to give a brief summary, you take a 2 hour interview slash exam with like an actual person, and they start to really dig into everything that you know about machine learning. It's four parts. The first part is like you solve like some linear regression equation from scratch or something like that.
Hmm.
The next part is like a Q&A on various technical subjects, which go beyond just machine learning. It's also just like engineering in general. The next part, you have to do like a data exploration slash build a model in like 30 minutes or something. And then the next part is like a system design machine learning case study. So like really basically covers everything that you might expect in an interview. So
Yeah.
I started seeking out like those external like assessments. Like so TripleByte is one of them. There's also like Workera, which is Coursera's like employee type
Yeah.
program.
Yeah. I heard
It's
of that.
pretty solid. And so yeah, that's yeah, that'd be my advice.
So just kind of like getting yourself like understanding of like basically where the bar was, like understanding basically just like leveling yourself, right? Like just figuring out exactly how you were compared to other people.
Yeah. Oh,
That's
and
super.
actually, so one other thing I wanted to add is, so I think machine learning was probably once you have a solid understanding of it, it's probably not that difficult as is like probability and stats questions, at least for my background, because I don't have like an extreme depth of stats knowledge. And so that always presented a problem is like whenever I got asked a question, I had to like fumble around and think about it for a bit. And like I always like to say that like assume that you're only at 70% like capacity or like potential
Yeah.
for passing an interview. Like once you actually get asked a question in an interview, if you have to think about it for too long, then it's probably like a KO.
Yeah.
To be honest, so like assume you're only going to be at 70% of your actual potential, and so yeah, so I think the stats and probability questions. There's so many cool websites that just have like sample questions. So that's the other advice I would give is like actually solve those questions. Because it's one thing to understand just the idea of probability, but it's another thing to understand like how many different permutations you can fit people into elevators or something like that, right?
Yep. Yeah.
So
And I
yeah,
think that has been the strategy that we've tried to take at Interview Query too, is just give you as many different common kind of situations. And then I think it's kind of like this, like I wouldn't say it's gamified, but it's almost like you need to be able to like pattern match this to like a type of problem pretty quickly. Like you need to know this is like binomial. You need to know that this is Bayes. There's going to be wording in there that you can basically figure it out, but you just have to kind of see it beforehand. You don't want to go in blind for any of these things because, as you said, if you do have to take the time to think, then you're probably already behind everyone
yeah,
else at that
that's
point.
exactly right. Yep.
That's cool. So I guess you did all this work. You kind of like leveled yourself, and then did you eventually? I guess once you got the interview with Rakuten, like I guess or other companies, did you feel like you're at the place where at that point you could pass like any number of interviews at like a higher rate than you were previously?
That's a good question. Yes, only because whenever I had an interview lined up, I tried my best to like strategically space it out so that I had at least a day after to recover and just review material.
Yep.
And so I basically like whenever I had an interview coming up, I would only focus on what I thought would be asked in that interview. And surprisingly, I was actually able to be right most of the like actually every single time I was able to anticipate like it's going to be more of this type of interview than this type of interview,
Mm-hmm.
which is like super helpful because like with all the amount of knowledge that you have to know to pass a data science interview, you have to give yourself an advantage because like for example, the way I learned it was like a waterfall approach, right? Where I first learned like machine learning, then I learned like these stats problems, and I learned like then I focused on leak code for like 2.5 weeks, just did leak code, etc. By the time I finished everything and like I came to review everything, I was like, oh shoot, like I'm actually pretty rusty at this. So like, yeah, that's just an example of like you have to give yourself as much of an advantage as possible. So yeah, so I made sure that when I had an upcoming interview, I would only focus on what I thought would be asked. And so with Rakuten, I knew that the first interview was going to be a coding screen, so I only did leak code problems.
Gotcha.
And then the final round, I was like, okay, it's probably going to be some more coding and maybe some more like machine learning slash deep learning, and that's exactly what it was. And so yeah, it's really about preparation.
Gotcha. Yeah, strategy for preparation is super important. I think you hit the nail on the head there in terms of the breadth, in terms of what's going to be on it, and then just like understanding then how you're gonna focus your studying. I guess like that's great. Like you got the job, and so now that you're kind of like past this whole experience, um, do you have any like general takeaways that you kind of came away from, or like almost like a something that you would tell someone who's going through like the same experience, like how they should kind of like start and kind of end their like interview experience, in terms of just like something that you got and like a lesson that you came away from that basically stuck to you that you wouldn't have experienced if you hadn't done it.
For sure. Yeah, I mean, I had the unique opportunity of when I started, I had come across Coursera's like how to be a data scientist or how to be a machine learning engineer like tracks. So they basically laid out like all the courses that were required, and I just picked like what I thought I needed the most. And so the reason why I start with this point is that I think before you start your job journey, try to make sure that you have a solid foundation in everything that you might need to know to pass an interview. Because if you start with the interview prep before the solid fundamentals, there's bound to be a lot of holes and gaps, and you just may not feel that confident with the material. I mean, obviously this is unique to everyone, but just first start by figuring out what those gaps are. And with data science and machine learning, it's going to vary between like software engineering skills, so you know to practice LeetCode, or like product skills. With product, it's a lot more difficult to actually practice for. I would highly recommend Interview Query. I
Yes.
don't think there's yeah, I don't think there's a better site out there for product questions, honestly. Um, Same thing with SQL questions, actually, as I think Interview Query is pretty solid. There's also another site, I think it's like mode.com.
Yeah,
Uh,
mode analytics.
okay, yeah, that's right. So yeah, that one's super solid. It was really helpful. And then so there's like stats/probabilities, which is like another huge field in itself. So make sure you have that foundation first. I'm not saying like get a master's degree. I'm not saying like take 2 months just to study. Like that's not what I'm saying. It's just somewhere along your journey, you're going to be way better off if you have that foundation. So try to get that first. And then the next thing is like, yeah, definitely pace yourself. Like we when I say like it's okay to only send out 3 to 5 applications a day, we might think like, oh, that only takes like 30 minutes. Like, why would you only do that much? But honestly, it's exhausting. So definitely pace yourself. It's okay if you spend one day just applying and you can get like 30 applications in. Like that's huge. Like if you can do that once a week, like that's massive for your chances.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, try to just have a schedule. Honestly, like you can say like this week I'm only going to do leak code problems, and this week I'm only going to do these kinds of problems. And I felt that like taking a week at a time to dedicate to one particular skill was the most effective for me, because there's a lot of loss inefficiency from context switching.
Yep.
So like yeah, I can go deeper into a subject if I devote day after day after day to it, than I can if I'm like hopping around different subjects. So that's the advice I would give. And then also like figure out where you rank. Honestly, like if you have 6 years of experience in data science, then you can probably like wing it off of just hitting a job board. Um, and but like if you're just starting out, then you might consider something else. Like you might consider I don't know, maybe going for a job that's not necessarily your dream job, but just like something that can help you build your way up. So yeah, just having like a realistic expectation, really, because honestly, this disappointment in life comes from our idea of expectations. So if you can temper your expectations, it'll be better for your mental health in the long run.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think the what's like that diagram where they show like your happiness is like the difference between expectations and reality.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
And I think you know, a lot of the stuff that I think and I want Interview Query to actually do in the future is to kind of like set, I think, expectations a little bit more,
Mm,
and communicate those, I think, because what I think I've seen happen is that we see a lot of people like, you know, entering master's programs or doing boot camps and coming out with just like a definitive answer that they're going to get a data science job afterwards. And that's completely untrue. You know, it's kind of like expecting that you're immediately going to get, you know, like a high paying job after you leave just college. It's like nowadays there is a lot of extra work that kind of has to happen to get through, as you said, right? And I think that being able to communicate that effect and like communicate what the work is that has to be done is definitely necessary just to really like uh, hold those expectations in high regard because I do think there is like a weird disconnect sometimes now. I think with like, you know, how education kind of works with how they acquire, you know, their students. I mean, this is a little bit off tangent, but just generally, I think when they have like some idea of what they're selling, and then I think once you hit reality, it's a little bit different in terms of what you really have to do next. And,
Absolutely. And yeah, I mean, to add on to that, like it's possible that maybe you spend 6 months at a really good boot camp and like on paper, you know, all the foundations of being a data scientist. Like it's possible that like you have that. Um, but employers don't necessarily trust that, unfortunately.
yeah.
And I mean, I think it's for good reason, honestly. Like employers want people who have spent some time thinking about data problems that take months to solve, and just like have that, you know, business experience as well. So yeah. And the other thing I also want to add that I forgot to mention in terms of just like increasing the probability of getting a job is like hitting job boards right after the job is posted. Like if you can send your application out like maybe less than 3 days or less after it's posted, like I found roughly like that increases my chances by about like 30%, which is absolutely huge when you're sending like dozens of these every week.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's the other tip I want to give.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that is definitely a big factor that most people don't know about because you know, even when I was at Nextdoor and we'd get resumes in, like I remember like we wouldn't look at them after, you know, the first 200. I mean, we would have enough people by then, right? Like after you look through 200 resumes, you're not going to look through the next 2,000 for like an even better candidate. So
Right.
and usually you can get 200 resumes in like 2 days, and so I
Yeah,
think
easily.
this is something that people don't know too much about, and I think is also kind of interesting just in terms of what what is like becoming the more efficiency part of like the job boards. Like, you know, if more people know this, then it's the whole strategy kind of gets a little bit less efficient, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
yeah, it's kind of interesting in terms of how employers might kind of correct, or how job seekers might kind of try to find like new ways to you know, it's just strategies to just get better and find jobs.
Yeah, and the hopeful thing is that if you really want the job, like effort is generally rewarded in the sense that like a lot of people aren't that motivated. Like honestly, the average person is not that motivated to get a new job.
Yeah.
So if you really do have that that motivation, you're gonna stand out because like let's say for example, you when you apply to a job like this, they send over an online assessment that takes like an hour to complete. If you can complete that way faster than the other people, and just the fact that you're completing it in the first place, like that'll set you apart more than you think, because most people are lazy, honestly. So
Yeah.
that's the one thing I will say, just like as positive advice, is like effort and motivation do go a long way too.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think I think that the effort that I've seen, and it's not like put in like a shitty resume and a shitty cover letter kind of effort to like 100 companies. It's more like, you know, put your effort in like a very smart manner, I think. And
Yes, yes,
it's kind of
yes.
like working smart, right? Like, you know, you can work inefficiently, and then you can work efficiently and get everything done, you know, in a quick manner. And I think that definitely matters. Um,
Absolutely.
cool, Alex. This was an amazing discussion. I want to wrap it up by asking you where people could find out more about what you're doing, if you have any kind of projects that you're trying to promote, or anything, a blog or anything. I'd love for them to send your way, just for people to kind of learn more.
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, you can find me on LinkedIn. I guess it would be smart to put my LinkedIn URL in the description.
Yep, definitely.
So we can go ahead and do that. And then I don't have any blog posts. I do have a couple of side projects that I'm starting. I guess I could promote those. If you're into fantasy basketball and you search fantasy basketball into the or like into the Chrome store or the Mozilla Firefox store, we should be the first one that comes up. So Fantasy Basketball Wizard is actually my project.
Oh, cool.
And it had about 10,000 users before the NBA season got canceled. But yeah, if you're into fantasy basketball, feel free to check out that extension. It's called Fantasy Basketball Wizard.
That's coming back up
Um,
though.
yeah, it is coming back up. Yeah, for like a few weeks, I think, and then it's playoffs, so that should be pretty exciting. Yeah, and in terms of what I'm working on now, so yeah, as I mentioned, I'm a machine learning engineer at Rakuten. It's like still a really early team. We're still trying to figure out what we want to do long term and like how to execute. So there's probably not too much to report there on that end. But yeah, if you're interested in Rakuten stuff, you can follow them on LinkedIn, or just reach out to me if you have any questions. LinkedIn is probably the best way to reach me.
Awesome. Cool. Thanks so much for taking the time again today, and congrats on stabilizing everything and not being in a roller coaster. And I think just being able to practice data science also for everyone involved is just really a great privilege as well, I think.
Thanks, Jay.
So,
Yeah, it was
yeah,
a pleasure meeting you, and it was a lot of fun speaking today.
yeah, I'll talk to you later.
See ya.